He was a man who moved in shadows and spoke in lead. But he froze when he felt a small, trembling hand tugging at his tailored sleeve. Looking down, he found himself staring into the tearful eyes of a 6-year-old holding a crumpled $2 bill as if it were a king's ransom. The midday sun beat down on the cracked pavement of the east side, but it did nothing to warm the cold atmosphere surrounding Maxie. He stood outside his fortress-like headquarters, a man of tattoos and gold chains, watching the city move with the practiced indifference of the damned. Beside him, a passerby in a blue jacket hurried along, eyes glued to the ground, representing the millions who chose to see nothing. Maxie's hand, usually reserved for gripping a weapon or a glass of expensive scotch, was suddenly occupied by a sweat-soaked bill offered by a girl in a faded pink t-shirt. Zola's voice was barely a whisper over the city noise, but what she said about her mother, Imani, stopped the heart of a man who thought he had none left. The city didn't breathe without Maxie's permission. Or at least that was the unspoken law of the Ironbound district. He was a man built of hard angles and heavy silence. His presence announced not by words, but by the rhythmic clinking of the thick gold chain against his chest and the dark ink that crawled up his neck like a warning. To the local shopkeepers, he was a ghost they paid to stay away. To his enemies, he was a surgical strike waiting to happen. Maxie operated on a no exceptions code that had turned the Ironbound syndicate into an untouchable machine. Business was a game of cold math, and in Maxie's world, there was no room for the variable of mercy. He stood on the corner of 5th and Main, his muscular frame draped in a black suit that fit like armor, his hair slicked back with a precision that mirrored his lifestyle. Beside him, the city pulsed with its usual apathy. An older man in a blue jacket shuffled past, eyes fixed firmly on the cracked sidewalk, personifying the thousands who lived their lives by looking the other way. This was the world Maxie had mastered, a place where the strong took, the weak hid, and the indifferent survived. His reputation was a shield that kept the chaos at bay, built on 15 years of never letting a debt go unpaid or a rule go unbroken. His lieutenants stood a respectful 3 paces behind him, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats that never dared to materialize. They knew the legend of the man they served, the boss who had once dismantled an entire rival crew over a single breach of territory. A man whose heart was rumored to be as cold as the steel of the shipping containers he controlled. In his world, emotion was a debt you couldn't afford to carry. If you couldn't pay, you didn't play. If you broke the code, you were erased. It was a simple, brutal philosophy that had kept him at the top of the food chain, far above the desperate scuffling of the streets. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and cheap street food. The ambient noise of the industrial district, a low hum that Maxie usually tuned out. He was checking his watch, calculating the timing for a meeting with a high-level distributor, when the rhythm of his day was shattered. It wasn't the sound of a gunshot or the screech of tires that stopped him. It was a light, hesitant tug on the sleeve of his jacket. A touch so faint it was almost an insult to a man of his standing. Maxie froze. His men moved instinctively, their hands drifting toward their waistbands. But he held up a sharp, tattooed hand to still them. He looked down, expecting a pickpocket or a brave beggar. Instead, he found a pair of wide, tearful eyes looking back at him. Zola stood there, a small figure in a bright pink t-shirt that looked garish against the gray concrete. Her face was a mask of heartbreak, her brow furrowed with a desperation that bypassed his defenses. Without a word, the most feared man in the city crouched down, his expensive suit trousers straining against his powerful legs. He was now at eye level with a child who shouldn't have known his name, let alone had the courage to touch him. Zola's hands were shaking as she reached out, extending a crumpled, sweat-stained $2 bill toward him. It was a pathetic amount of money for a man who moved millions. Yet he looked at the bill with more intensity than he had ever given a ledger. The no exceptions boss was looking at a contract he hadn't asked for, offered by a client who had nothing left to lose. The silence on the corner of 5th and Main stretched thin, vibrating with the shock of 1,000 unsaid words. Maxie stared at the crumpled $2 bill, then back at the girl whose eyes were pools of liquid grief. His men shifted behind him, their shadows looming large and dark over the pavement. Yet Zola didn't flinch. She didn't retreat from the tattoos that marked his skin or the cold, predatory stillness that usually sent grown men scurrying to the other side of the street. "Why me, kid?" Maxie's voice was a low rasp, unused to speaking to anyone who didn't owe him a debt or a favor. He looked past her at the passerby in the blue jacket, who was now nearly a block away, fleeing the scene of a tragedy he refused to witness. The city was full of people who were paid to help. Officers in crisp uniforms, doctors in white coats, social workers with clipboards. Yet this child had sought out the man in the black suit with the gold chain. Zola's lip trembled, but her gaze remained locked on his. She told him about the police station where the man behind the glass didn't even look up from his computer, telling her to go home and wait for a phone call that never came. She spoke of the hospital where the lady in the blue scrubs had sighed, pointing to a sign about insurance and unpaid balances, while her mother, Imani, struggled for air in the backseat of a neighbor's car. To the authorities, Imani was a case number and Zola was a nuisance. They followed the rules of a world that functioned on paperwork and protocol. Rules that were currently killing her mother. "They won't look at me," Zola whispered, her voice cracking as a single tear finally escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "But everyone looks at you. Everyone is afraid of you." Maxie felt a strange, cold pressure in his chest. She hadn't chosen him out of a lack of options. She had chosen him because he was the only force in the city powerful enough to ignore the rules that were suffocating her family. She didn't want a civil servant. She wanted a monster who could bite back at the system. In her innocent, desperate logic, the ice boss wasn't a villain. He was the only man who wasn't invisible. He looked at the $2 bill again. It was a joke, a fraction of the cost of the silk tie he wore. Yet as she stood her ground against the syndicate's most feared enforcers, it felt heavier than any briefcase of cash he'd ever handled. She had bypassed the legal criminals in the high rises and the indifferent protectors in the precincts to find the one man who operated outside the lines. "They said you're the man who gets things done," she added, her small hand reaching out again to touch the gold chain that hung around his neck. "I don't need a hero. I just need my mommy to breathe." Maxie stood up slowly, the joints in his knees popping in the quiet air. He didn't take the money. Not yet. But he didn't turn away either. He looked at his lieutenants, who were waiting for him to laugh or push the girl aside and get to their meeting. Instead, he saw his own reflection in Zola's wide eyes. A man who had spent his whole life building a fortress of fear, only to have a 6-year-old girl walk right through the front gate and ask for the keys. The no exceptions code was still there, etched into his mind. But for the first time in 15 years, the math didn't add up. The world had looked away from Zola. But Maxie realized that if he looked away now, he would be no different from the man in the blue jacket. The walk to Zola's apartment felt like descending into a world the sun had forgotten. Maxie moved through the narrow, trash-strewn alleyways with his lieutenants flanking him, their polished leather shoes crunching over broken glass and discarded needles. Usually, the ironbound syndicate entered these buildings to collect what was owed or to remind people who owned the air they breathed. But as Maxie climbed the stairs of the tenement building, the heavy silence of the stairwell began to press against him. It was the silence of people who had stopped calling for help because they knew no one was listening. 3 floors up, the air grew thick and stagnant, smelling of damp drywall and the metallic tang of old pipes. Zola led him to a door with a peeling number 4 hanging by a single screw. She didn't knock. She pushed it open with the wary familiarity of a child who had grown up too fast inside. The apartment was a skeleton of a home. There was a small table with a single chair, a stack of books in the corner, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Maxie stepped over the threshold, his muscular frame making the small living area feel even more claustrophobic. His eyes, trained to spot threats in every shadow, immediately locked onto the bed in the corner. There lay Imani. She was a ghost of a woman, her skin a dull gray against the thin, yellowed sheets, her chest labored with a terrifying, rhythmic hitch, a dry, shallow sound like sandpaper on stone. Beside the bed stood a portable oxygen concentrator, its lights dark and its plastic tubing coiled like a dead snake on the floor. It was a piece of life-saving machinery reduced to a useless hunk of plastic because a bill hadn't been paid. Maxie approached the bedside, his gold chain catching the dim light filtering through a window covered in duct tape. He had seen men die in many ways, sudden, violent, and loud, but he had never seen anyone fade with such quiet, agonizing dignity. Imani's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. She saw the suit, the tattoos, and the heavy presence of a man who belonged in a boardroom or a backroom, not her bedroom. For a second, fear flickered in her gaze. But then she saw Zola standing behind him, clutching the $2 bill like a talisman. Who? Imani's voice was nothing more than a wet rattle in her throat. She couldn't finish the question before a coughing fit seized her, her entire body racking with the effort to pull oxygen from the thin, stale air. Maxie didn't answer. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over the cold metal of the oxygen machine. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew the mechanics of power. He knew that somewhere in this city, a switch had been flipped and a line had been cut because the profit margin didn't justify the life in front of him. He looked at the bedside table, empty medicine bottles and a glass of water with a layer of dust on top. Zola stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch her mother's forehead. "I hired him, Mommy," she whispered, her voice filled with a desperate, heartbreaking pride. "He's going to make the machine work again." Maxie felt a tightening in his jaw, a cold rage beginning to replace the professional detachment that had been his armor for 15 years. He looked at Imani, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and a tiny, flickering spark of hope that was more painful to witness than her despair. He was the boss of the ironbound syndicate, a man who moved millions. Yet here he stood in a room where life was being measured in minutes and a single tank of air. He turned to his lead lieutenant, who was standing by the door, his hand already on his phone. Maxie didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes was a death warrant for anyone standing between that woman and her next breath. The "no exceptions" code was being rewritten in the silence of that third-floor apartment. The city thought it knew what Maxie was capable of, but they had only seen him protect his territory. They hadn't seen him protect a soul. Maxie stood in the center of the suffocating room, his eyes tracking every jagged, shallow breath Imani took. The silence of the apartment was broken only by that terrifying rattle and the distant, mocking sound of city traffic 3 stories below. He turned his gaze to the bedside table, sweeping aside a stack of final notices with a gloved hand until he found a business card tucked into the frame of a mirror. It bore the logo of a private medical equity firm. But across the back, someone had scrawled a name and a phone number in aggressive, jagged ink. Zola, Maxie said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum that seemed to steady the air. The men who came here. The ones who took the medicine. Tell me about them. Zola looked up, her small face hardening with a memory that no child should carry. They weren't like the doctors, she whispered. They had shiny suits. But they smelled like old cigarettes. One of them had a smile that looked like it was made of broken glass. And the other one? She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward her mother. He had gold teeth, all across the front. When he laughed at Mommy for crying. I saw them. He called himself the Snake. Behind Maxie, his lead lieutenant, Kenji, stiffened. The name rippled through the room like a cold draft. In the underworld of the Ironbound district, there were predators. And then there were scavengers. The Snake was Viktor Kosov, a man who ran a predatory collection racket disguised as a medical supply company, along with his brother, Mikhail. The Kosov brothers specialized in distressed assets, which, in their world, meant buying up the debts of the dying and stripping them of their dignity before they hit the grave. They were the kind of men Maxie usually ignored because their business was too small, too filthy, and too devoid of honor to be worth his time. But hearing Zola describe the gold teeth and the laughter changed the math. The Kosovs weren't just businessmen. They were the legal criminals who hid behind contracts to commit acts of cruelty that even the syndicate found repulsive. They had taken Imani's oxygen not because they needed the equipment, but because they wanted to pressure a dying woman into signing over a microscopic life insurance policy. The Snake, Maxie repeated, the words tasting like ash. He looked at the $2 bill still clutched in Zola's hand. The Kosovs had come for thousands and left with her mother's life. Zola had come to him with $2 and offered him his humanity. Maxie reached out and finally took the bill from the girl's hand. He didn't put it in his wallet. He tucked it carefully into the breast pocket of his suit, right against his heart. It was a formal acceptance of the contract. Kenji, Maxie said, not turning around. Call the warehouse on 4th. Tell them we aren't doing the garment shipment tonight. Tell them to break out the heavy kits. Boss? Kenji hesitated. The Kosovs have a deal with the local precinct. If we hit their medical depot, it's not just a turf war. It's a public mess. Maxie turned then, and the expression on his face made the seasoned enforcer take a step back. It wasn't the look of a businessman protecting a bottom line. It was the look of a man who had just looked into the abyss and realized he was the only thing standing between it and a child. The Snake thinks he can laugh at a dying woman because she's poor, Maxie said, his voice like grinding stones. He thinks he's safe because he carries a briefcase instead of a gun. Tonight, I'm going to show him that in this city, there is only one law that matters. And it isn't his. He looked back at Imani, whose eyes were closed now, her skin turning a frightening shade of blue. Time was no longer a luxury. It was the enemy. He leaned down and whispered to Zola. Stay with her. Keep her hand in yours. Don't let go. No matter what you hear outside. As Maxie walked out of the apartment, his gold chain caught the dim light of the hallway one last time. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man on a mission of vengeance. Funded by a child's last $2. The snake had the gold teeth, but Maxie had the iron-bound syndicate. And before the sun rose, he would make sure the Kossoff brothers learned the true price of their greed. Would you like me to write Chapter 5? Where Maxie ignores his advisor's warnings and prepares the iron-bound mobilization. The descent down the tenement stairs was louder than the ascent. The heavy tread of Maxie's boots echoed like a drumbeat, a rhythmic declaration of war that signaled the end of his legendary neutrality. By the time they hit the sidewalk, the air outside felt different. Sharper, charged with the static of an approaching storm. Maxie stopped beside his black SUV, the chrome reflecting the harsh streetlights of the ironbound district. He pulled the crumpled $2 bill from his pocket, smoothing it out against the hood of the car with a slow, deliberate thumb. "Boss, we need to talk," Kenji said, stepping into Maxie's personal space. His voice lowered but urgent. "This isn't our lane. The Kossoff brothers are scum." "Yeah, but they're connected scum. They pay the city's oversight committees to look the other way. If we move on their warehouse to grab medical supplies, we're breaking the non-interference pact we signed 3 years ago. The board will see this as a rogue play." Maxie didn't look up. He was staring at the portrait of Jefferson on the bill, seeing instead the tear-streaked face of the girl upstairs. "The pact was about territory and trade," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It wasn't a license for scavengers to pull the lungs out of my neighborhood. It's a $20,000 debt." Maxie, another lieutenant, Leo, added, throwing his hands up. "That's what this is about. We could just pay the Kossoffs off if it bothers you that much. Write a check, get the oxygen back, and we still make the 11 p.m. drop at the docks. Why are we talking about mobilizing the heavy kits for a job that pays $2? Quote. Maxie finally looked up, and the coldness in his eyes silenced the street. It wasn't the calculating gaze of a businessman weighing a loss. It was the look of a man who had suddenly realized that his rules were a cage. For 15 years, he had operated on the principle that if it didn't turn a profit, it wasn't his problem. He had allowed the city to rot around him as long as his borders remained secure. "You think I'm doing this for the money?" Maxie asked, his voice stepping over them like a giant. "The child didn't go to the police. She didn't go to the church. She walked past every good man in a blue jacket and came to me. She came to me because she knows the only thing that stops a man with gold teeth from laughing at the dying is a man with sharper teeth." He took a step toward Kenji, his muscular frame looming. "The code says we don't involve ourselves in domestic disputes. But the code also says the syndicate protects its own. This neighborhood is mine. Those streets are mine. And if the legal system allows a man to steal the breath from a woman's lungs over 20 grand, then the system is broken. And I am the only fix left. The board will call for your head," Kenji warned, though his posture began to straighten in reluctant admiration. "Let them," Maxie countered. He reached into his suit and pulled out his encrypted phone. "I've spent my whole life making people afraid of what I'll do for power. Tonight, I'm going to make them afraid of what I'll do for a $2 contract." He began swiping through his contacts, triggering a silent alarm that would wake every sleeper cell and enforcer under his command. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a mobilization. "Call the mechanic," Maxie ordered. "Tell him I need the heavy-duty breaching charges and the thermal medical crates. We aren't just going in to talk. We're going in to take everything they stole and a little bit more for the trouble."